Do you have extremely stubborn adductors and also pinchy hips? If you answered yes to one of those questions, then I most likely know the answer to the second question. Now, when I say stubborn, I mean the adductors just always feel tight, they're weak, and maybe you stretch them, you experience some relief, but then the stiffness just keeps coming back long term, and you can't experience that increased flexibility. And this is just some neurologic guarding that's occurring in these adductors. So this video is going to go over how we can address these symptoms. Now, it's not surprising that this is my most requested video to make, and this just goes to show you the importance and relevance the adductors have with both hip pain and function. Now, when it comes to my own journey with improving my overall hip flexibility and decreasing my pain in my hips, the adductors were probably the most difficult muscles to release. Now, I will say the most stubborn muscles are probably going to have the biggest impact in your overall function. Now, there's hundreds of exercises out there to stretch and strengthen your adductors, but I wanted to make this video in the context of improving adductor flexibility while also experiencing FAI, or femoral acetabular impingement. Because if you're experiencing this condition, then you're going to have to take a different approach than most people when it comes to stretching the adductors. Now, I want to use this video to share my own experience going through this process, because my adductors were my most guarded muscle group, and they still are to some degree. But when I do get these babies to release, then every single aspect of my hip mobility increases. My hip rotation, my hip flexion, my hip extension. My approach is you have to attack the adductors from all angles. From an anatomy perspective, adductors is actually a terrible name for this muscle group, because adduction is only one action the adductors do. In fact, they have a significant role in both hip flexion and extension, as well as internal and external rotation. So it depends what angle the femur is starting in to determine the muscular action that they will have. Therefore, we can't just work abduction, adduction. We have to think about hip flexion, we have to think about hip extension, and we have to think about creating adduction and abduction in these different planes of motion. Let's talk about some differences. Your adductor magnus, which is a muscle of the posterior chain, is actually a stronger hip extensor coming out of deep hip flexion. So think about a weighted squat. Your adductor magnus is going to produce that hip extension coming out of the deep squat. And in contrast to that, your adductor longus is actually a very strong hip flexor coming out of deep hip extension. So if I was to drive my knee forward into the ground right now, I'm actually creating some loading through the adductor longus. So when you stretch into hip extension, you're actually stretching the adductors. When you stretch into hip flexion, you're stretching the adductors as well. So it doesn't always mean we have to do abduction, adduction to stretch the adductors. But I will say, when it comes to hip impingement, in my experience, doing a lot of hip flexion related stretching was very bothersome for my hips. So things like frog pose, where you needed to sit back to get a bigger stretch through the adductors, or even something like horse stance. This actually created a lot of jamming in the hips because I didn't have adequate internal and external rotation. So when I freed up internal and external rotation before doing stretches like that, it made it feel much better. But the issue with not having a lot of hip flexion from the start, which we know is present with FAI, is you just don't have really good leverage to stretch the adductors. So I do find that working more abduction, adduction is one of the most important things to do at first. So it's not like a frog stretch and the horse stance are bad. They just might not be suitable for your current level, and you might not benefit from them until you've actually improved your hip flexion to some degree. When you work on improving your abduction and adduction, you can make your hip flexion better as well, and you can also help improve your hip internal rotation. The adductors do function as internal rotators, so that's why it's also very important to strengthen the adductors in their shortened ranges so we can create more of that internal rotation as well. Your adductors, you have more of them on the front side of the hip, So they're going to primarily be hip flexors. When you have tight adductors, they have a lot of leverage to kind of pull you into this anterior pelvic tilt. The anterior pelvic tilt will increase the coverage of the acetabulum over the femoral head, so you have less space to flex the hip. Now, I don't want to say that just having an anterior pelvic tilt is going to be bad. There's plenty of people with a natural anterior pelvic tilt. In fact, most of us have that have adequate hip flexion. So this all comes down to your own unique limitations. But if you have limited hip flexion and you have tight adductors and you have tight hip flexors pulling you into this anterior pelvic tilt, it reduces the ability for you to internally rotate for most people. So this is where also improving your hip extension, I have another video of that as well, but I can go through some examples in this video. Improving your hip extension is going to improve your adductor flexibility. I also want to touch on the role of the obliques. So your obliques have an interesting fascial connection with the adductors. Your opposing oblique, when one contracts, the adductor will lengthen. So in my experience, working on my oblique flexibility significantly improved my adductor flexibility as well. So we will go over some of those strategies also. So in summary, we need to improve oblique flexibility. This will improve how our hips feel as well. We need to improve adductor flexibility in both hip extension and flexion. And last, we need to choose stretches that create the most leverage to lengthen the adductors. And if you're a stiff bastard like me, you need leverage, you need load to actually make some adaptations. And this is a reason why, something like the horse stance or frog stretch just was never effective for me in my beginning stages, is because there's just not enough leverage. If you have really dense and stiff connective tissues, you need added external force to get those things to budge. Not only create strength at end range, but just also get you to a range of motion where we're making these plastic changes both neurologically and biologically, increasing those sarcomeres in series, creating a longer muscle. So let's get into it. Okay, let's go over how to properly stretch the obliques so we can get more out of our adductor stretching after. Now we're going to start off more isolated to the obliques, and also it's going to kind of look like we're stretching the glutes into adduction as well. So everything's connected. Ironically, improving adduction of the hip will improve the way your adductors feel as well into abduction, because we create space on the opposite side. So these stretches will have a little bit of glute flexibility work in there as well, but it's not the primary focus. So after we do more isolated oblique stretching, we're going to integrate that into adductor stretching as well. A very easy way to do this is starting in a side plank type of position. Now, I like to do this on my hand with an arm straight. If you have wrist pain or shoulder pain, just elevate your forearms on a bench or something. So we can use something like this. And then from here, from the top position, we're just going to sink the hip down to the ground, okay? So we're going to get a lot of length through the oblique here. Now, this can also be a QL stretch as well. But to differentiate, a QL stretch will be a more posterior tilt. If you posterior tilt, you're going to feel this more in the back side of the low back. If you anterior tilt, so the hip is actually now moving behind the knee and then sink down, we get this more toward the front of the hip and front side of the lateral trunk, okay? So I want to create this anterior pelvic tilt so we can improve that hip flexion ability. Now, once I'm side bent here, I'm going to now rotate toward the ground. This rotation toward the same side hip is going to get a good lengthening effect through the external oblique. Okay, so I rotate toward the ground. I can place my hand here for just support, and then I'm going to take deep inhales and exhales. So inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth. When I exhale, I'm going to think about anteriorly tilting the pelvis even more. So I'm pushing my hip back even more. Okay, that's just one way to do it as a static stretch. And this hip feels so much more decompressed after doing that. So you can also do this kind of dynamically. So here, sinking down and rotating back. This is very low load, so you can do this high frequency. You can do it every day. If you want to do it as a training stimulus, then you're going to want to work at an intensity where maybe you're going closer to failure, after about 20 reps. If you're getting over 20 reps, then maybe you can add some weight to the hip and maybe do 10 to 15 and take it to fatigue. And then you'll need recovery in between. So here's some ways we can progress that. We can elevate the knees on the bench. Okay, drop the hips, rotate down, keep that anterior pelvic tilt. Okay, so now we can do this with a longer lever with straight legs. Now you could do this posted up on the arm, but it's just more comfortable to take that stability demand out of the equation. Elevate your forearm on another bench. Okay, so from here, drop the hip down, anterior tilt. You can keep a slight knee bend here to help assist with that anterior pelvic tilt. And this is where you can supercharge it, is you rotate your shoulders toward the ground and then up. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of good lengthening through the obliques, a little bit through the lateral hip as well. Now this strategy is primarily loading the side bend component of the obliques. So we can actually do a more relaxed strategy to prioritize the rotational component of the obliques. So we are kind of rotating the torso toward the ground to create that rotation in these drills, but we're not primarily loading rotation. So what I like to do is a 90-90 position. Now we're not using this to stretch the hips, we're using it to stretch the obliques. I'm going to get my torso upright. Think about tilting the pelvis forward, anterior pelvic tilt, and then I'm going to rotate to the side. I'm using this hand to pull myself into more rotation, and this hand to push myself more upright. So it helps to kind of get on your fingertips here and not have a flat hand. Okay, so I'm rotating. I'm going to inhale, drive my hand into my knee, and then rotate even further. Now, it also helps to think about pulling the pelvis the opposite direction as your torso rotates. So I like to even lift this knee up off the ground. This helps pull the pelvis the other way. Inhale, relax, rotate further. You could do this 3 to 5 cycles, 5 to 10 second, contract, relax. Okay, so one of the most apprehensive ranges for me personally used to be abduction with my hip pushed forward, like this. So I used to just only be able to abduct the hip with a massive anterior pelvic tilt and hinging forward with my torso, which, is necessary. That's natural with hip anatomy and how that works. With a push forward pelvis, we really only do have about 45 degrees worth of abduction. But that being said, I couldn't even get out to 15 degrees without stabbing pain in my hips, but now it's much better. And here's a drill that can really improve that using oblique stretching. So I'm going to start off in a position that's relatively comfortable. Maybe it's just a little bit outside hip width. I'm going to push my pelvis forward. So we are creating some hip extension. So posterior tilt here. We're stretching the hip flexor component of the adductors, in particular adductor longus and pectineus, as well as brevis as well. So from here, I'm going to side bend the opposite direction. Okay, so I should feel a lot of stretch through here. And then think about rotating away slightly. And you'll get a little bit of lengthening through this opposite adductor. And then come back to center. You could feel like you can shimmy out just a little bit more. Side bend. About 5-second hold. Remember we said crunching down with the opposite oblique. That opposite oblique contraction will cause some relaxation due to the fascial component here. So I'm crunching down on the oblique, extending my arms to increase the lever, slightly rotating toward my right, come back to center, and then we can keep abducting. And I feel a really good stretch through the groin here. So we could do about 3 to 5 reps to one side, maybe reset, and then start over on the other side. So I'm starting backed off in a range where there's not really much pain at all. Shimmy out. Okay, so I just want to show you how you can really quickly get through some of that adductor guarding by lengthening the obliques. It's a very powerful and kind of unknown strategy. You know, oftentimes people just go directly for the adductors. Look at the muscles that have a unique relationship and close relationship with the muscle groups that are most guarded, and you'll be able to get through them a little bit easier. Okay, so this leads us into drills to improve hip abduction in an extended hip position. So one drill I really like is a front foot elevated hip extension stretch with the foot turned out. So I'm going to elevate one foot on a bench. This hip flexion will help pull the pelvis on the opposite side into a posterior tilt, creating a little bit of hip extension. I'm going to extend this hip. Now normally this would be a good hip extension stretch, getting a stretch through the psoas, iliacus, a little bit of the rec fem. Now what I'm going to do is turn my toes out completely. And a way to now leverage an adductor stretch further is through rotation. So I'm rotating away. This is a relative external rotation. Here, I'm going to try to turn my torso to the opposite side and press the hip forward in space. Now I get a really good pull in the adductor on this back leg. Now from here, what I could do is try to drag my foot forward, try to squeeze my feet together, creating a good contraction here through the adductors. Relax, I can push my hip even more forward or try to rotate my torso more to the opposite side. From here, you can do this as a static contract relax, or we can load this, we can hold weights by the side and push forward and rotate. Another strategy I'll use sometimes is have a cable machine here and then use the external load from the cable to pull me into more rotation. And this gets a nice pull on the adductor there. Now what we can even do is elevate the working leg instead of the non-working leg. This is a little bit more of an advanced strategy. So once you get comfortable with the first one, you can kind of move on to this one. I'm going to have my shin directly parallel on the bench, and then I'm going to rotate my torso across. Now I already feel a pretty good stretch in my adductor here, so I'm going to use a little bit extra weight to leverage that. So I'm just doing these lunges here, back and forth, really thinking about driving through this back knee to come out of it. So this one we can do dynamically 4 reps. For a lot of people, I like just using one weight as a contralateral load. This helps kind of push you toward the opposite side. And then eventually trying to get more upright here and keeping the glute squeezed on this back leg. Something to note with these drills, especially if you're very apprehensive in them, less is more. So just start off in a range where you could feel a little bit of stretch and then work on actively contracting the adductors as hard as you can in and out of range, and eventually the nervous system will give you a bit more range. Okay, now let's go over more coordinative strategies. We'll go over Copenhagen style planks. These drills were very pivotal for me, especially when I was going through my adductor tendinopathy, which I had for over a year and a half. And not only did these drills help improve the tendon quality in my adductor, but they also really freed up the range of motion there as well. It got rid of a lot of pinchiness in my hip. It was interesting. While I was going through my adductor injury, this was also when my hips were starting to feel the best because I was really working on loading the adductors just something I was missing in my training. I was only kind of working on stretching the adductors aggressively, and that led to some overuse. So I started performing a lot of strengthening exercises in the end range for my adductors, and this is where, you know, things really started to benefit my hips. We've all seen Copenhagen planks before, you know, elevating the foot on a bench and holding here, okay? Good one for strengthening the adductors, but it's not really doing much for us in our end range of motion. So I'm going to elevate my forearm on the bench, okay? And then I'm going to dip my hips toward the ground as my torso gets upright. And then press through, come back up. I'm thinking about pulling this foot out, squeezing the glutes as I go down, and then back up. We can hold here isometrically, just actively crushing the foot into the ground, and then we can work on even elevating this foot on yoga blocks so we're getting more and more range. If loading your adductors through Copenhagen variations is new to you, you can easily do this on a wall. So just stepping your foot out a little bit outside of hip width, lean against the wall, press the hip toward the wall, and then come out. As we lean the hip into the wall, drive the foot in the direction of the wall to come back out. So we're getting some good loading through the adductor here. We can even try to hike this hip on this side to bring us into more abduction on the other side. And again, we can dynamically load that for reps with some pauses in between. Okay, we're going to get into improving abduction in a hip flexed position. So a lot of these drills I'm going to show you at first are going to look like drills that I would give somebody to improve their hip internal or external rotation. So I'm going to get into this wide sit position known as a bear sit. I'm going to have a band anchored up from high, and I'm going to get that looped around my knee. So from here, I'm going to get a wide position, so I'm getting a lot of length through my adductors, okay? If it's very difficult for you to sit in this position and you're kind of like this and you can't keep an anterior pelvic tilt, because we do need that anterior pelvic tilt to get length through the adductors, then I would suggest you sit on something like a foam roller or a yoga block. Now from here, use the hands behind you to prop yourself upright, pull the knee in, and then let the band pull the knee out, okay? So make sure we get a lot of tension on the band. This is a bit loose. I would probably use something a little bit heavier for me. We want to get a nice, strong contraction through the adductors, and then pull back out, okay? So we're really strengthening through internal and stretching through external rotation here. Remember, the adductors, they're not just abductors, adductors, they're internal and external rotators, primarily internal rotators. So we want to contract as much as we can through internal, relax into external. It's okay if you have a little bit of compensation here with trunk support to pull the knee further down, whatever gives you leverage to get a nice strong adductor contraction. If you're really limited and like this is all you could do, then it might help to get a little bit of that trunk involvement. But ideally what we're looking for is keeping the glute fixated on the ground as you're pulling, and just contract as hard as you can into adduction and then back out. And then you can even crank your knees up toward your chest as you go through the reps, as long as it's not very pinchy. So do this for 5 to 10 repetitions, 3 to 5 second hold each, and your adductor stretches will be feeling much looser. So just a little bit of context with my own hip pain, and where I felt the most apprehension was this position. On my back, feet together, letting my knees come out to the side. Immediately, I would just feel shaking in my adductors. If you were to push on my adductors in this position, they would be rock hard. They'd just be extremely guarded. They did not want to go through this range. So, you know, cold, I can do this, and it feels kind of fine. I just feel a stretch through my adductors. Before, it would just be pinching everywhere. Another test that didn't feel good was the Faber test, right? So one foot on the opposite knee, let the knee fall out to the side. Just immense pinching and pain in the closing angle of the joint. Adductors would just not want to let go, especially on this right hip. You know, this knee would just stay up here And then again, adductors were rock hard. So working into positions like this, and you know what, I'm going to show you the setup for all this just so you could see the struggle. Because sometimes people ask me, how do you get the weights onto the knees? How do you get into the position? I'm just going to show you. So bear with me here. Okay, feet together. Sometimes I'll just start in the butterfly. Okay, down on the back. Squeeze the glutes, pull the knees down toward the ground, and drive the knees up. Okay, so for you guys, I mean, this is a 10 kg plate, so 25 pounds. Start with something small, like bumper plates work well here, not weight like dumbbells or kettlebells, because if you don't have a lot of hip flexion, you need something to hold on to. Partner assist works good as well. So allow the weight to push you down. You're probably going to want to start very conservative, and then over the course of high repetitions, you'll get your knees lower to the ground. I actually really like higher repetitions here. So anywhere from 20 to 25, 30 reps. And then each repetition, you're squeezing your glutes, your side butts, to pull your knees toward the ground. Squeeze, then come out. Squeeze, full contraction up, okay? So this position, we're biasing external rotation. One I like even more than this is the supine wall frog. Okay, supine wall frog, also known as the baby maker for obvious reasons. Again, I'm going to show you the setup so you can see the struggle. That's the only downside with this one. Well, two downsides. It's really uncomfortable at first, especially if you have pinchy hips. And two, it's just kind of annoying to set up, especially if you're using heavier weights. So again, I'm going to show you the process. Nice. Okay, that was actually easy. Now, the goal with this one is to have the shins directly parallel. So I want the foot directly underneath the knee. Now, your current level will dictate where you start with this. So if you're really tight, you're going to have your foot high up. Usually I'll rest my feet on yoga blocks at a set height, but I'm just going to show you at different levels here. So for me, I'll probably work down here. Ideally, you want the foot lower than the knee so that you could strengthen through internal rotation, and I think that's the biggest benefit of this drill. Technically, this is like a horse stance on your back, but the horse stance, remember, it's loading through hip flexion extension. This is loading through internal external rotation and abduction adduction. So with the feet fixed on the wall, I could press my feet into the wall, push my knees up. So I'm thinking about actively anteriorly tilting while pushing my knees up, creating that hip flexion and internal rotation, and then squeeze the glutes to pull myself down. The first set of this, especially if you're very apprehensive in this position, it feels like trash. And then as you go throughout the reps and sets, multiple sets, you'll feel your nervous system start to relax a bit. And the stretch actually starts benefiting you, and it actually feels really good. And every single time I do this stretch, in fact, before I stretch my middle splits, this is always a drill in my warm-up because it makes my hips feel really good. And you could retest your horse stance after this, and it'll feel really opened up and less pinchy. So I'm trying to actively push my knees up as high as I can. It's almost like an active W sit at the top. And then over time, I can walk my feet lower down the wall. Okay, then you can hold on the last rep. Again, high repetitions here because you're not going to be able to load this one very heavy unless you have partner assist. So I really don't ever go past 25-pound plates. All right, and then just so you could see, nice wide horse stance. Afterwards, feels much more comfortable in the hips. I could get into much more hip flexion, less pinchy pain. Even still, if I go into a horse stance cold, I'll get some pinchiness in the hips, and it takes a few sets to warm up into it. But after this, money. Okay, now we're going to get into some straight leg variations for adductor flexibility. Now, the traditional frog rock back, right? We talked about this one, how a lot of times you're just limited in hip flexion, and that's what's preventing you from getting a good stretch into abduction. So then we can take this one step further by doing the half middle split or half frog stretch. Now again, a lot of times people will get a good stretch here, but they also feel pretty pinchy in this hip. So there's a few ways to work around this. One, you could just turn this foot in, so you're in a little bit more external rotation, so you can get away with less hip flexion on this hip. Or two, this is going to seem counterintuitive to you, but the people who prescribe this stretch for you, if you have hip impingement, they don't understand the struggle of being stiff and having hip pain. So I'm going to actually elevate my foot on yoga blocks. And you'll notice I have these yoga blocks stacked on top of a slider. So I have what this foot elevation is going to do. Let's make sure it's not getting caught on the floor. Is it's going to pre-position this leg in a greater stretch before this one really needs to lengthen, or before I need to even sit back to get a good stretch here. Now, why does this seem counterintuitive? Because it's like, oh, why are you doing this? If you're already very stiff through the adductors, isn't the pelvis just gonna tip that way and go along for the ride and you're just compensating? Yes, but I would rather have a little bit of compensation and not worry about my non-working leg and still get a massive stretch through this side adductor. Okay, so I actually have a lot more leverage now to pull deeper into this stretch, and then this one isn't limiting me as much. Because if I wasn't in this elevated position, now look what I have to do. I have to split this leg out even more, and now it's getting a little bit jammed up in that leg. So if I elevate this leg on the blocks, less demand for this hip to abduct, which is already in a little bit more hip flexion from the start. Now, what could we do to intensify this? Put a weight plate on top of the back. Now, when you're placing the weight plate on the pelvis here, we want it to be more situated toward the stretching side hip. Okay, so it actually helps. So if your leg is elevated, the pelvis is going to be higher on this side, but that extra load helps press that hip further down into the ground. And all of our contract, relax, loaded stretching principles apply here. Driving the foot hard into the block, relaxing 5 to 10 seconds, squeezing the glute, trying to pull the leg out further into abduction, or sitting back into a little bit more hip flexion. Okay guys, we're almost done. And of course, if you stuck around this long, you know I'm going to save the best for last. And that is the kettlebell wall middle split. Now you don't need a wall for this, but I prefer it because it's more stability. So if you have a gym access and you have a wide range of kettlebells, this is going to be the bread and butter exercise. People ask me all the time, what's my favorite exercise for the middle split? And I will tell them it's the middle split. But for those of you who don't have goals to do the splits, then this exercise is the next best thing, because it's basically doing a split, but it's biasing pure abduction and adduction. A middle split has other components involved, hip flexion, hip rotation, and then even your ankle mobility and your tibial rotation can come into play as well. And sometimes people don't feel as stable training the middle split. So this is a really great way to bias pure abduction, adduction. So let's go over some strategies we can do with the kettlebell middle split. So I'm going to get my butt as far up to the wall as possible. Sometimes I'll even place a towel roll under my low back to keep that anterior pelvic tilt. I'm using, let's see, these are 18 pounds, I think 8 kilograms. Relatively light for me. Since I was so stiff, I actually built up to 20 kilograms each foot. So that's 44 pounds each foot, and I was doing that for 5-6 reps. And I needed this amount of weight to get to my full depth here. But now I could get to that same depth using 18 kilograms. So it's going to be different for everyone what your starting point is. You're going to want to build strength here first and then work your way back down. Okay, so strategy 1 is just dynamic reps. Nice and slow on the way down. Get to your end range. Squeeze your quads, squeeze your glutes, and then back up. Okay, so you can do these kind of low weight, pumping style motion up and down. The main thing is you don't want to feel too much through the joint. It's okay if you feel a little bit of discomfort at first, and then that discomfort goes away, but we want to feel the adductors working. We want to feel the adductors getting pumped. That's something we don't really get to feel in a lot of different adductor stretches. So this one is a great one for strengthening these adductors through length. So, okay, I'm just going dynamically here. Another strategy I really like to use is using a heavier weight. So say this is like 16 kilograms or 20 kilograms. I'll go really heavy on the way down, nice and slow, 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 pause at the bottom, squeeze, and then I'll go hand assist back up. So these are eccentric. So you want to do slow repetitions and just a few reps, maybe 3 to 5 reps of those. So that's a really great way to get that eccentric loading and extra range of motion. If you're really trying to build range of motion, then going heavy and then using hand assist back up is really fantastic. Because if we think about it, end range stretching is a lot of just eccentric loading, eccentric contractions. One of the other really nice strategies I like to use is just static holds at the bottom. 2 things I like to do here. Contract, relax into rotation. If you have hip impingement, we know we want to contract and relax into rotation. So adductors are internal rotators. I'm going to pull my toes into the kettlebells as if I'm trying to internally rotate my femurs. 5 seconds, relax, actively externally rotate. Inhale, exhale. If my legs want to go down further, let them go down. Again, contract, inhale, relax into external rotation. Last strategy I'll do is a regressive contraction for the shortening muscles. I'll put my hands on the outside of my thighs, and I will push my thighs into my hands as if I'm trying to do a hip thrust. Engage those glutes, relax. Push, I'm trying to almost lift my butt up off the floor and do a hip thrust in this position. Relax, see if I can go a little bit deeper. Whew. Oh, come on out of that. 3 to 5 sets, 1 to 2 times a week. All right, guys, that's the video. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Hopefully, you've tried out the exercises and your adductors are nice and loose and you could sit into a squat much more comfortably. Now, I'm curious to hear your experience with FAI, pinchy hips, stubborn adductors. Write them in the comments. If you have any questions, let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. Feel free to give these exercises a try. Let me know how they worked for you personally, and let's have a conversation about it. If you want some more personal guidance, I offer assessments as well as online coaching and programs on my website to improve your hip mobility. If you found this video useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot. All right, guys, peace.